How is it going, guys? And welcome back to another episode here on my YouTube channel. Hope you're all doing well and that you are ready to join me to jump into a session that I played at PLO 50. Now, if you guys like this content, then make sure to give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and also check out PLOmastermind.com if you want to learn more about the great game of Pot Limit Omaha. Guys, let's jump straight into it. We're starting off on the right side. I'm gonna start the footage. I 3-bet pre-flop, and I flop an overpair and a gutter on Jack 5-3. Now on this board, we have to keep in mind that neither of us will have a lot of very strong hands on the flop, but both of us will have a decent amount of like one pair with a flush draw, for example. But I have on the flop the better overpairs, right? It's more often that I have aces and my opponent, for example, has kings or queens. Now that being said, it's not a board where I'm gonna do that much betting on myself because I'm in position. I also have the option to check back and see a free card and not risk betting and getting check raised. Let's imagine I bet my hand and then face a check raise. I'm not in a great spot, especially given the fact that we are over 100 big blinds deep here. So I check on the flop back, and if we look into a similar solution here in PLO Trainer, this is Jack 5-3, same board, structure basically, but different suits, but the idea is the same. You can see that in position is only betting roughly 49% of the time. Now if we look into ace, king 4, which is the hand that we have, then we can see that if I have a flush draw, it's a very clear bet, right? We have so much equity, we want to build a pot. But if we don't have a flush draw, you'll see that the frequency of betting drops quite heavily. We're still betting most of the time if we have a backdoor flush draw, so we're stacking still an additional component. Not only do we have the overpair and the gutter, but we also have the backdoor flush draw. Still a hand good enough to bet, but if we don't have that, you can see that we're pretty much always supposed to check back, and therefore the hand in question here is also supposed to be a check back, at least in theory. Now, of course, sometimes there are adjustments that we want to make, and therefore we want to bet more often. In game here, I decided to go ahead still for a check back. On the turn, my opponent bets fairly large, but I think we have a straightforward call here. Nothing else really that I should do. Pretty bad river, I would say, because the hearts come in. I don't block any of the hearts. Now my opponent checks, saying basically that he probably doesn't have hearts, because I think a lot of hearts will still value bet. He ended up still checking his second nut flush actually, and taking it down. Okay, on the left side, I think what happened is that I opened pre. Let me replay this a little bit actually. On the left side, I decided to flat call in position against an under the gun open. Now this is kind of interesting, right? Like this could potentially be a hand that we want to 3-bet. Let's take a look into PLO Trainer and see what we can learn here. So I'm gonna go to pre-flop. I select the ggpoker 100 structure here. I go to cutoff versus an EP RFI and quickly try to learn whether or not this hand is played correctly pre-flop. So ace 10-9-8. If we are double suited, of course, we have a very straightforward 3-bet. But if we are single suited, you can see that on the right side with the nut suit, we're pretty much going for a 3-bet most of the time. Actually, this hand is also supposed to be a call. So calling and 3-betting here seem both to be quite okay, actually. So the call is fine. We go 4-way to a flop. Kind of interesting. We do have a pair and a gutter and one heart. Now, once you have a pair blocker, and you are up against multiple opponents, that value of the pair blocker is quite powerful actually, because you block so many of your opponent's best made hands, right? Like even the 9 here is still a powerful component because we block 9-9 and queen-9. My opponents all checked on the flop, so it's not that likely that they have queen-queen, for example, but of course still possible. I decided to bet and basically turn my hand into a bluff. Now I need some bluffs on the flop. The best blocker on the flop is definitely the queen, but adding in some 9x with additional equity I think is fine. I wouldn't mind a check back either on the flop actually. But again, the theme of the video, guys, or the theme of my session here was to be more aggressive, right? And find opportunities to start betting, start barreling, and put my opponents under pressure. And that's also what I did on the flop and now continuously do on the turn. This is a blank turn. I'm basically saying against my opponent, now I have queen 9 or better. Since my opponent didn't check raise on the flop, a lot of his best hands are excluded from his range. Yes, this is quite light. And generally speaking, a hand like this, I would say in theory is more often going to be a check than a bet. But exploring, trying things out, guys, I don't think that's necessarily bad. Unfortunately, my opponent ended up check raising and I have a very straightforward fold there. Okay, let's see what else kind of hands we will have in this session. On the right side, straightforward open, right? Ace 10, 8, 7, triple suited. Let's see what happens. We see a cold call by the small blind, and this is quite unusual, except if you're up against recreational players, like he is playing a 25 big blind stack, first of all. And secondly, at that stack size, you don't really want to have a calling range in the small blind, I would say. You pretty much want to go ahead and bet or raise or fold, basically. Flop quite good here at SPR 3, middle pair and the nut flush draw. I do have 3 diamonds though, so I don't mind just going large here, put as much pressure as possible. And I can even fold out some hands like Jack, Jack or Queen, Queen there. Okay, my opponent did fold. Right side could be a hand to open there every now and then. Jack 10, 7, 6 single, but I ended up folding. I do like a fold on the right side now, which I luckily do. And on the left side, I have a very straightforward defend, basically. Now, this is a board where I could consider leading. The disadvantage is that I don't have a backdoor flush draw, but it is a rainbow board and I have a gutter. So I don't think leading out is necessarily a bad thing. I do lead. Pretty bad turn to continuously barrel. I don't have a pair blocker and I don't have a flush draw, basically. So I like to check here and then check fold, which is what I end up doing there. Leading on those kind of boards, definitely a significant part of the strategy, guys. You always want to think about how does the board interact with your opponent's range and how can you take advantage of that, right? Like you should, of course, think about your own range, but exploitatively, what helps also is to really go all in on like, how does the board interact with your opponent's range? And then think about, is there a way to exploit it? So if the board is really bad for your opponent's range, then what often you can do is you can apply pressure on your opponent and try to force him out of the pot there, basically. Okay, let's see what happens on the right side. I think I go ahead and check raise. I think that's fine. It's a little bit tricky, right? Because we are very, very deep. So I could also see myself just check calling. Check raising is definitely fine. The thing is though, if we get raised now, we might have to fold actually. And if we get called, a lot of turns and rivers will be tricky to play because I don't have that much backup really. So can go different ways there, I would say. Queen 8-4 on the right. This is definitely a hand to fold from this position. It is a clear open on the button and sometimes an open on the cutoff, I would say. Depending a little bit on how tight your opponents are. On the left side, 10-8-7-4, also a fold. It's too disconnected, even though the hand is double suited and it looks playable in a sense. It depends a lot on the position that you are in. Against a min raise there, still a straightforward fold, but my weak hand, and this is an open. Jack 10-9-7 single. I would open raise this hand from every position. And on the flop here, this is a board where I generally would do a lot of betting because I'm out of position, the board is draw heavy, and I have mainly overpairs. But my hand has some backup and therefore more playability. We're up against a looser range, it seems. So I think I want to extend my betting range there and add this one in. I also think I'm going to see a lot of checkbacks there because I block my opponent's stabbing range quite heavily. On the right side, I decided to flat call. And now on the flop, we could consider betting. The thing is that we don't have a diamond or a flush draw, and I have some equity, right? So I don't mind checking. If I bet and get check raised, it's not great, but we do have to fold then. On the turn, I would like to see myself betting. It's sort of a bluff, even though we have like significant showdown value, but we have so much going on the board basically that I don't expect to get check raised almost ever. And if I get check called, I probably am ahead. So it's sort of a protection bet slash value bet. It's kind of weird to explain, but it is what it is basically. On the right side, ace, king, queen, 5. Let's see, what is this? Is this a hand to 3-bet? Now it becomes interesting. Like we could potentially squeeze. Ace, king, queen, 5 on the right side against an open and multiple callers. Let's take a look here, guys, if we can learn anything from it. So let's say we have an open and a call and a call. I'm not gonna let the small blind call in this scenario because it simply doesn't in theory. So I'm gonna use a slightly different scenario, and you can see that it's somewhat mixed, right? We see some calling, we see some 3-betting with ace, king, queen, 5 double. Now if we are better connected, ace, king, queen, 10, ace, king, queen, 9, like those hands. Ace, king, queen, 9 even also a little bit mixed, by the way. Anyway, here we can go both directions. My opponent seems to be a little bit loose. Who open raises, also the caller is probably a little bit too loose, so I don't mind coming in for a squeeze. I think I remember this hand actually. We squeeze and we go 4-way to a flop, and there's definitely some SPR left, especially against the cutoff, who is sitting on 400 big blinds. I'm deciding to go ahead and check here. And the reason I check here is because the board is somewhat draw heavy. If I bet, I mean, I could have 2 sizings for sure. But if I bet and get raised, it's not that great. So I much rather check and hope to see my opponents check back. Maybe do something against one opponent. On the turn, it's fairly likely that at this point I have the best hand. Like the 4 doesn't really improve my opponents that often. Since they all checked, it's feels somewhat weak. So what do we want to do? Ace, king, queen. We block kings, which is not that bad actually. It's quite close, I would say, between betting and checking. I go for this sizing. I'm not sure how much I like the sizing. Maybe I want to pot because the board is so draw heavy. I think potting is a little bit better actually. This is also somewhat of, it's not a clear value bet, right? Like it's more a hand like, let's see what happens, and also let's try to push my opponents out of the pot. But if that's the goal, then I might rather go ahead and bet full pot, actually. I get called by one opponent, and the 10 rolls off. Now, it's quite interesting. Like, my opponent calls a big bet on the turn. He didn't check, or he didn't bet himself on the flop. He basically says he doesn't have 2 pair or better on the flop. Also not on the turn, I would say, because he probably raises. So the question is, does the 10 improve him to queen 10 or jack 9? And I don't know. Like the fact that the hearts missed and I don't have any heart, the fact that the low straight draws missed, makes me quite tempting actually. I do go ahead and make the call, and my opponent shows up with ace 6 5 4, and he had a low pair plus open-ender, and we take down a nice pot. That's great. A pretty big one. Kind of interesting. Okay, nice. Happy with that one, of course. And on the left side, in the meantime, I am winning. I mean, I don't know what happened because I focused primarily on the right hand. But let's leave it what it is for now. Right side, I do open. The big blind seems to be relatively tight. A7 4 on the right. This is a board where I will also have a checking range. No pair blocker, no equity, basically. Let's go ahead and check, I would say. Maybe do something on the turn. And on the left side, it's not great against a pot, but I think I do have to make the call. On On this blank turn, I'm probably going to end up check folding if he bets large, which is what he does. Let's see if there's any other interesting hands coming up, guys. Definitely happy with the big one on the right, of course. Right side, ace, ace, jack for double. Very straightforward squeeze, obviously. I'm going to squeeze pretty much all my aces here. And on the left side, we are folding. Flop bottom pair with my overpair, of course. This is a hand that is a very straightforward check back. You don't want to bet and get raised here. So just check and keep the pot small. See if you can pick up some equity on the turn, or if you see a safe turn, basically. And also keep your opponent's range as wide as possible. On the 9, I would say we also want to check. Not much changed at this point. The board is still very draw heavy. And the river 9 is actually quite good, I would say. Even though there is clubs, like I think a lot of his clubs he will either bet on the flop or on the turn. And we do take it down. Now let's take a look here what happens. So this guy plays Jack 10, 8, 8. He turns a rep on the 9. I think on the 9 he wants to bet himself. He wants to put pressure on aces and kings while having a lot of equity and future blocker potential. So I think that this is a little bit too passive on the turn, and I would like to see a bet from his side there. On the left table, I'm potting the turn. I think the flop goes check, check. It's pretty close on the turn because there are so many draws available and the river will change the nut so often that it's not a great spot. I'm definitely not going to check raise on the turn. So the question is check call or bet. I do bet on the river as well. I pretty much have the nuts here because my opponent checks back on the flop. Maybe I should bet a bit smaller. It's possible. It's possible. Not sure. On the right side, Jack 10, 9, 5 double. This is a hand that you want to open raise. And on the left side, I don't know. On the left side, I think it's a fold actually. On the right side, we flop a pair and a gutter. Against a small blind call, I don't mind the check, but I wouldn't also mind a bet, to be honest. But I think no heart, no king blocker, no ace. We block Jack, Jack, and 10, 10. I think a check back is actually quite okay. Raise on the turn seems standard-ish. We turn the nuts and we have additional equity. Pretty bad river to 7 of hearts. My opponent leads out, and I think on this run out, basically, my opponent will have so many hands with showdown value that it's pretty hard for him to have a lot of bluffs there. So we also don't have a hard block or anything, so it's probably anyway a fold. But that being said, like since your opponent does call a turn raise and the board is the way it is against a small blind range, he will have a lot of like 2 pairs, some sets, straights, hearts of course, and a lot of those non-hard hands basically he's not going to turn into bluffs. So I think a hand to definitely fold out there, or to fold basically in my shoes. 7, 7, 6, 4. This is a hand I'm going to play. Start with an open raise. I would call against a 3-bet. And on the left side, I would also open. The big blind seems to be really tight there. So you do want to go ahead and steal aggressively against these players. And on the right side, very easy check call, I would say. You could argue to bet as well, actually. But if you bet and get called, it becomes more difficult to navigate, right? Because your opponent's range is suddenly a lot wider. We turn straight. And I would say we have a call. It's not a great scenario to be in, right? Because we don't block any of the pairs. But we just have a straight here. and we're still beating all my opponent's bluffs, and we are still beating 8x, and my opponent can still be bluffing with hands, yes, that have equity, but that we are doing really well against. So I think we just have to call and then make a decision on the river, basically. This is actually a pretty good river run out because there are now two pairs paired, basically, making it less likely that he has a boat. My opponent was bluffing ace-5, and we do take it down there. On the right side, I'm not entirely sure what happened. It probably went, I imagine, bet by myself on the flop, turn check, check. And now on the river, I'm folding. Yeah, that must be what happened, basically. On the left side, I will go ahead and... It's kind of interesting, right? Like, generally speaking, we want to 3-bet hands that are a little bit higher ranked in cards. MP versus EP here, like, it's not a scenario that plays that great as a call because my suits will be dominated. So I wouldn't mind a 3-bet. But let's also briefly look into PLO Trainer and look at the same scenario, 8-7-5-4. We can see that the double suited variation is pretty much going to be a call. But the EV difference between calling and 3-betting is basically 0. So you could also argue to 3-bet there, basically. Now the question is 3-betting better in reality than calling? I mean, if there are a lot of recreational players on your left, calling probably makes more sense. If you know your opponent is capable of folding, for example, kings or queens, then 3-betting makes more sense. So these are the things to keep in mind, I would say. I'm going to go ahead and 3-bet here. It's also a hand that can easily call a potential 4-bet. Okay, let's see what happens. We flop a pair and a gutter. No flush draw, no backdoor flush draw, no flush draw blocker or backdoor flush draw blocker. I would like to see myself checking. I mean, we could bet fold, actually. No, I think checking is best. I think checking is actually pretty good. Although we unblock queens and jacks, hands that will fold against the bet. So I don't think betting actually is that bad on the flop. Turn easy call. We turn an open ender. And we have some bluffing potential on the river. However, my opponent goes into a double barrel and we have a straightforward fold there, of course. On the right, I think this is an open. The ace and the king blocker. We have two tight players on my left. The big blind is pretty loose, which is disadvantageous for sure. But probably post-flop will work out okay-ish. This is not a great turn. We're going to fold. On the left side, I will go ahead and call ace-9, 6-5, a nut suit. Too weak to squeeze, but definitely good enough to play. In multi-way pots, guys, and I think I also spoke about that in my last video, basically. The thing to keep in mind is that because you're up against more players, you want to play hands that perform well against more players, right? So a common mistake is to play wider because you get better odds, but you will play also wider with hands that are going to be dominated more often. And that's not going to be a profitable play with a lot of those hands. So what you want to do is you play fairly tight, actually, but those hands are going to make more money for you. Especially hands with the nut suit generally perform quite nicely. On the right side, I called the flop and the turn, which I think is okay. We could raise at some point, but my opponent, I think I remember that he was, I don't know actually what I remembered about him. Maybe I felt like he was a little bit on the tighter end, but 31, maybe his PFR was pretty tight. Not sure. Anyway, End up folding on the river, which I think is fine. And we're moving on. 9763 on the right side is a fold, yeah? 973. I'm actually quickly checking that on my other window. No, a 9763 double suited in the cutoff is actually an open. So I folded that hand, which is incorrect. Just betting on the right, building a pot. Nothing to add. Let's see what the small blind does. He makes the fold. There are some top sets on boards like this that you could consider checking back, sort of trapping, right, slow playing. But if you do that, then you need to do that with hands that heavily block your opponent's continuing range and also that perform really well on almost any turn, right? The hands to do that with are, generally speaking, hands where you are not only blocking top set, but also, for example, the nut flush draw or a flush draw and a straight draw. Like, you're stacking so many components that it's so likely your opponent is going to go ahead and fold that the EV of checking is going to be higher than that one of betting, basically. Open raise on the left, fairly standard. And on the right side, I decide to 3-bet, which is... It looks a little bit loose, but we are pretty deep. So let's take a look, actually. So we're going to go ahead and find a 200 big blind solution. A button against early position. Supposed to 3-bet 6.8%. How about ace 884? Double suited. This hand is actually a call. And it's also a serious difference between calling and 3-betting. In other words, my hand is too loose. Now ace 885, it becomes closer. Ace 886, 7. The 7 is basically a clear 3-bet, and everything else is more often leaning towards a call. Okay, so this one is a little bit too loose on the right. This is generally a check, I would say, because we have a medium strong draw, right? And we're in position. However, we also have a hand that is going to block a decent amount of my opponent's draws. Straight draws, flush draws, and therefore if we bet, we can fold out over pairs. If we get check raised, I mean, we have a pretty easy fold, I would say. So I don't mind the bet. It's also somewhat exploitative, I would say. Now, my opponent leads out on the turn after check calling. I think we have just a call against that sizing and a quick check on the river. My opponent was, what was he doing? He check calls, jack, 9-6, pretty loose, and then pre-flop it's loose. Turn, I don't like it. I mean, turn, whatever. Look at the flop on the left, guys. We flop middle set and an open-ender and 2 backdoor flush draws, 4-way pot. Pre-flop I called, and now we are just calling, right? I mean, we have such a monster hand. The thing is, against this check raise, I mean, what hands are there pretty much that can check raise here that are not queen? You could almost ask yourself, right? Because I have so many of the draws and of the lower board covered, basically, that him having queen is not that unlikely in the spot, even though we have a monster right on the flop. He does show up with queen. Luckily, I turn the 8, making the straight. Let's see if we can take down this one. We win the first one, and we also win the second one. That is nice. That is nice, guys. Okay. And that's also gonna wrap it up for this session, guys. Hope you enjoyed this one. We're gonna do another one soon because I have a little bit more footage left. If you guys like this content, make sure subscribe to my channel, give the video a thumbs up, and I will catch you guys in the next one.